there's a whole lot of power in that sun. It's finally, there's a real feeling of spring today in the air, and I can start to get back at finishing the improvements on our fortified homestead that Kathy and I have been working on for 4 years, and we've affectionately called Kelly Station. And what came to mind today when I start thinking of my wee bits of history is how things can change, and that we value, we certainly value our property, or property that was handed down to us by our ancestors. I'm going to tell a story today about how 5 generations of people who worked diligently, were peaceful, had their whole world turned upside down. And I'm referring to what would become known as the Great Upheaval, or the expulsion of the Acadians from 1755 to 1763. And it is a horrific story. And if you can just kind of get your head around it, if you're a great-great-great-great-grandfather, so you were 5th or possibly 6th generation on a farm, had that ripped away from you, and had your family torn apart and scattered to the 4 corners of the world. That's what it was like in 1755 in Nova Scotia, Canada. Henry Longfellow, in a poem he wrote in 1847 titled The Tale of Acadie, and I'm going to try to quote it. He says, "Gone are the peasant farms and the farmers, forever departed and scattered by the ash and the leaves," or the dust and the leaves. It sets the stage. So I'm going to go back to the start of, like, where did the Acadians come from? Who were they? So French origin, 1606, the first community is established in what we know today as Nova Scotia. So it predates Jamestown, it predates Plymouth. In other words, it's old on this continent. Now, these people were brilliant. Instead of going inland and clearing vast forests, because it was all forested, they went into the salt flats, because we're talking an area with some of the highest tides in the world. And using a series of dikes and different systems, they were able to drain this area that was already cleared, and at the same time have this amazingly fertile soil. So they, over that 150 or so years, were able to create some of the most fertile ground in North America. And it's going to become sought after. The other thing is, we got to sort of delineate between French Canadians and the Acadians. Although they all immigrate from Quebec, we have a different culture that's developing in Acadia than we do, say, along the St. Lawrence, Montreal and Quebec. They're more tied to the homeland. These people have lived sort of independent of governments and other people or influences for literally decades. Anyway, I'm going to go get a cup of coffee, and I'll get into this terrible bit of history. We have to look at the Acadians as a people that didn't want trouble with anyone. They wanted neutrality. That's all they wanted. They didn't want to be part of any war. And if you think about it, over the time period we're talking, leading up to the expulsion or start of the expulsion in 1755, we have them at different times having to swear allegiance to a country. So 6 times it changed hands between French and English in that time period. And although they would swear allegiance to the king, they would not swear to take up arms, because the last thing the Acadians wanted was, if they were swearing allegiance to the king and war broke out, then they would have to take arms up against fellow Frenchmen. So they were able to, over that roughly 150-year period, to keep that neutrality going until the French and Indian War breaks out. And to put it in perspective, you have to remember this is 25 years before the American Revolution, so everybody that speaks English on the North American continent is English still. You fly the same flag. So 1755, we're seeing the French and Indian Wars is underway. If we look at the French, they've got the stronghold at Fortress Quebec, Montreal. They've also got Fort Louisbourg on Nova Scotia, or Cape Breton Island. The British have built Halifax. But the British are really concerned about this group of French-speaking citizens, although they're, as I said earlier, they're a distinct, different people, culture than the French Canadians that we think of. Now we have this fellow who's the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, and his name is Charles Lawrence, and he is, to put it bluntly, just a piece of work. He despises the Acadians. He's under a lot of pressure by the English colonists in the lower 13 colonies because they don't want this. They see it as a threat as well, even though they were no threat at all. They were a peaceful people, mostly tradesmen or farmers, and they did a lot of trading. They were very successful. And the other element was they had some of the most fertile ground, as I mentioned, in the North American continent, and lots of people wanted that land. So that's the situation in 1755. On Friday, September 5th, 1755, Lawrence orders Colonel John Winslow to call all the males older than 10 years of age to Grand Pre Church, which is one of the larger communities, one of the larger churches, to hear a message from His Excellency Charles Lawrence. And I'm going to read it. I'm going to do this from a note because I don't want to not get it correct. So verbatimly, he says, that your land and your tenant cattle of all kinds, livestock of all sorts, are forfeited to the crown, and all your other effects, your savings, your money, your household goods, and you yourself are to be removed from this province. I really struggled to get my head around what it must have been like to hear those words. And I think what it would be like for me personally if I was confronted with someone saying that to me. And although Kathy and I have been 4 years at building this fortified homestead, our little bit of history, I think about 5 to 6 generations of people that had put their hearts and souls into their properties, being told everything was being confiscated. So there's this fellow named Morris. He's from New England, and he devises a plan at this point to, in order to start the gathering of these people after this edict's been read to them. And he devises a plan to say, well, let's surround all the churches. So you got to visualize these Acadians spread out in villages about the province, some in New Brunswick, some in Maine, but they all had churches. They were God-fearing people. He comes up with a plan to, on a Sunday, when they're all at prayer, to surround the churches and try to capture as many as they can in the first round. And if they threatened to run off, they literally threatened their families at the point of a bayonet. So come with us, or we'll bayonet your wife and children. So with no option, they did. Now, by the fall of 1755, they've loaded 1,100 Acadians onto transport ships. And that first group to leave Acadia were sent primarily to South and North Carolina, Georgia, and some to the state of Pennsylvania. And that's just the start of what's just going to become a horrific genocide, as I pointed out at the start, where they made a concerted effort not only to get rid of them, but they wanted to entirely destroy their culture. They didn't want anything to do with these people, and they didn't want them to reunite, so they separated families. They separated husband and wife. They separated parents from, or children from their parents. And they deported them all over the world. These people who had known nothing less than a pastoral, peaceful life in the country, self-sufficient lifestyle, and a happy one, are now shipped off to the slums of England and France. So, but not all of the Acadians gave up peacefully. Notably, Joseph Brouchard, who led numerous raids against British troops, and some of them fairly effective. This is going to result in about 1,500 of these Acadians disappearing to either New France or to Cape Breton, and they literally disappear into the forest, supported by their Mi'kmaq allies that they, in a lot of cases, intermarried into their culture. Even some of their religious beliefs were followed or practiced by the Acadians. And that brings us to 1758, and we see the fall of Fort Louisbourg that year. Not going so well for the French in the French and Indian Wars. Things are starting to change. But when that fort falls, 3,100 Acadians are deported. And of those, 1,650, an estimated 60, I've heard the number 1,649, I'm going to say 1,650 die either from disease or drowning. And if you do the math, that's a 53% death rate of the people that were deported in 1758. But they're not going to stop there. This is only the beginning, and from 1758 right up until 1763, they're going to continue this deportating of the Acadian peoples. And in total, the numbers vary again, but certainly over 10,000, 10,500 is a figure that is sort of thrown about, that were torn apart and sent to all, as I said, four corners of the world. But a credit to these people, their strong nature. You think you're going to destroy them, just like the indigenous peoples of North America. They're still here, and they're coming back, and they're coming back strong in terms of reigniting and relearning their culture, as it was for the Acadians. So a lot of them end up in the New Orleans area, Louisiana, and that wasn't primarily because they were shipped there, but because it was a common language there. It was still primarily French, so they make their way there. They were known as Cajuns, and we get all the Cajun foods and the cultures that people explore to this very day down there. You can attribute to a bunch of Canadians in Canada. And the same with their culture now in Nova Scotia is strong. The ancestors, or the people that came from those 1,500 ancestors that escaped to New France and Cape Breton, have now grown to quite a large population, primarily in the province of Nova Scotia, but certainly in New Brunswick, which was their original home territory. Anyway, a sad note, a sad story, a sad reflection of the history of Canada by certain individuals. And enough sadness. I'm going to go enjoy some sun and nail down a couple more boards.